Howdy BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast content. On this Why People episode number 11, we'll talk to Andrew Suchoff, who's the Chief People Officer of Foundation Medicine. He's been a great supporter of the Boston HR Council and a really, really interesting conversation relative to his journey into the HR executive world. Let's get to it. All right. Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Why People podcast. Why People is a Boston HR Council production. For those new listeners, the Boston HR Council is one of the largest HR and people executive communities in the world, with over 1,500 chief human resources officers, chief people officers, and VP of HR council members. Joined by co-founder of the BHRC and co-host of the Why People podcast, Paul Roberts.
Hello, Sean. Great to see you. Very excited for today's episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And excited to introduce our guest today. Andrew Suchoff is the Chief People Officer at Foundation Medicine, also very instrumental in the creation and kind of the steerage of the Boston HR Council. So, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
It is a pleasure to be here. I can't believe 1,500 members?
1,500 active director level and higher members.
Wow.
New England, Florida, Texas, LA. We have some global. It's been pretty cool.
You both have created something that did not exist many, many years ago. You should feel really proud of that.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. And we owe a lot of kind of the thoughtfulness and, hey, have you thought about this? Or maybe don't think about that to you. So we appreciate your guidance along the way.
Thank you very much.
Andrew, we're excited to have this conversation. And I know we chatted on the pre-call a bit that you've seen, a little bit, bits and pieces of some of the previous episodes. But really, we approach the conversation in the same way, and it goes, wildly different every time, which is really, I think, the cool part of the show. But we're really interested in the feedback we've gotten from the community is folks want to know, with chief people officers and CHROs, hey, what about kind of your early on, your early life set you up for this type of work? A little bit about the career pathing that landed you in that top seat. And then, left the chat on the back end about, how we're thinking about the future and perhaps some advice for folks that are dreaming about one day being in the C-suite. So all that said, Andrew, do you want to maybe help, root us in your background or your, the early days of Andrew Suchoff?
Sure. I won't start with, the date of birth and where I was born, but I'll kind of give you just a high-level overview of my career, right? My career has really been a combination of, I'm going to call it both public environments and private equity environments, crossing a variety of different industries. So I've been in consumer goods, I've been in healthcare, I've been in pharmaceuticals, and I've been in biotech. I kind of categorized my career in growing up in two companies. So I started at the Gillette company. I was at Gillette for about 13 years or so. I was really fortunate. I went to Northeastern University. I went through the co-op program. I did a few co-ops with Gillette when I was in my undergrad, and then had the opportunity to continue working with them after graduation. My background's a little bit unique. I'm a finance guy by background and spent about 12 or 13 years with Gillette in different finance roles, covering financial planning, cost accounting. And then one of the roles that I had at Gillette was Manager of Benefits Global Design. And that actually provided me the exposure and experience to get in front of some of the HR folks, because it was still a financial role, clearly one of the biggest elements of a P&L, right? The cost of benefits. But it started to provide me exposure and experience to HR leadership. And as I started to get exposed to HR leadership, they started to, again, guys, this is probably, I don't want to age myself, but a long time ago when HR was a little bit more health and welfare. I brought a more analytical, methodical, systematic approach, and they kind of said, hey, this is interesting. Maybe we can put this guy into an HR role. At Gillette, I was given an opportunity to move to Singapore, and that really was the first entryway into my real first operational role within HR, and they took a big chance on me. Funny story is when they brought me into the office and said, hey, would you be interested in moving to Singapore in an HR role? We think that you've got some really kind of good attributes that would really help the HR organization thrive. I said, sure, where? And they said, Singapore. And I said, absolutely. Went back to my office, called my wife and said, where's Singapore? Because we may be moving there. So little by little, I got further exposed into HR. I was in Singapore, then I went to London and I ran HR for the UK and Ireland. And I was ready to come back to the United States. And one of the great things about being an expat is you get great experience, but also I came very atypical from the HR organization, right? So Gillette said, hey, here's an opportunity to come back to, I'm going to call it manager of compensation. And that's not where I wanted to be. And so I left. I went to work for Serono International. I moved to Switzerland and ran a variety of different global HR roles there. And that's really where I continue to thrive within HR, and also where I got the taste and the bug for being in life sciences, biotech. And from there, I've spent a variety of different roles within diagnostics, within early stage biotech, and now most recently at Foundation Medicine, where we do comprehensive genomic profiling on cancer.
Thanks for the background, Andrew. And geez, we've chatted quite a bit. We've become, friends over the years. There's parts of that story that I didn't know. So really interesting. A couple of notes I wrote down here and some questions based on what you shared. I guess the first one is, and you kind of, you copped to it. This was at Gillette was some years ago. I guess
that's being kind, Sean.
So my first question is, as a finance person, and just given the fact that that every one of your peers that we've had on the podcast has chatted about how the HR and people function has really ascended to a true pillar of the executive team and the executive thoughtfulness of an organization. Wasn't always necessarily viewed that way. So I'm just curious, as a finance person presented an HR opportunity, what was the initial kind of gut reaction, or how did you think about HR and people at the time when you were asked?
It's such a great question. I mean, very candidly terrified, right? Because I had never been in an HR role. So I thought, am I a one-stop shop kind of guy, right? So I had been in finance for 12 years. I didn't know anything other than that. But then when I started to explore the opportunity, I realized that just like that analytical mindset, that systematic, methodical, theory approach, and the ability to, and I would say this is really critical for anyone who wants to go into a senior level HR role, is understanding the business, being able to talk about a P&L, understanding the drivers of what ultimately impacts an organization's ability to be successful. You can be a more impressive, you can be a more well-rounded professional when you have that analytical mindset, when you have that financial backing, when you have that financial thinking, and a much better professional, a much better collaborator and partner to your CEO or executive leadership team. So for me, I thought it was a huge opportunity to get outside of my comfort zone and see if I could be successful. Never mind the opportunity to live overseas was super exciting.
Well, that was my next question, Andrew. So just kind of going by the timeline that you had chatted about, it's interesting because a lot of community members in the BHRC have been somewhat thrusted into a globally focused role in the last 3 years because of how much easier or how lower that barrier is given the technology and given what the pandemic showed us, right? So there's a lot of folks that were US centric and now have folks globally, whether their operations went globally or not, that's entirely different. But we have a lot of kind of questions coming in about, hey, I'm now global. What advice do you have, or who can you connect me with? It's interesting in your situation, Andrew, where your first exposure to HR was global. So my question was, the FP&A work you were doing before the HR work, was there a large global element to that? Or was the jump into the global HR work your first kind of taste of global and different cultures and things like that?
just by the nature of working at Gillette, right? It's such a global organization. So I had exposure in regards to the complexity of the operation and global pieces of it. But my real exposure to having global direct reports was in the global benefits design world. I had various different finance members from various different markets, dotted line reporting into me when we were looking at how do we pool benefits, how do we get the most out of the size of Gillette and capitalize on that. And one of the biggest initiatives I did before I left at Gillette was look at benefit designs across Europe. The DB plans, at that point, it was defined benefit plans, defined contribution plans, and see how could we capitalize on that and how could we leverage this and ultimately have savings across the European market. So that was kind of my first exposure to real global role. It's interesting though, when you say like people are becoming just more global by the nature of their role, or it's hard to take on a global role. The cultural nuances, the sensitivities, the tolerance, it's really important to assimilate and understand what are the norms in these various different markets versus not norms. And let me give you a great example. So I remember one of my first meetings in when I was in Singapore, sitting in Indonesia, and I had HR leaders from various different markets reporting into me. And I was sitting there on stage, and I had my feet crossed, and I had the sole of my shoe exposed to the audience. And I could tell all of a sudden, like the climate in the room changed, and we took a break, and then someone came up to me from either Malaysia or Indonesia and said, "We just need to let you know that is like the most disrespectful thing that you can do here." And it was an aha moment for me, in the sense of I have a lot of learning to do in regards to ensuring my credibility and building relationships and whatnot. So it's so critically important to understand those nuances market to market, and they exist in every single market.
Yeah, and outside of leaning on teammates or constituents from that area, Andrew, is there an easy way to find out what you don't know?
Ask a lot of questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. Never be afraid to ask for help. Also, there's this book. There's a book around. I forget what it was called, but in different markets. And when you're an expat, and you can read that, and it's kind of like the 101 for going into that market, the 101 for going into London, the 101 for going into Asia. And it's interesting, Sean, because I would say in some regards, London was my hardest assignment. And you would think, oh, it should be the easiest because everyone speaks English. But the way of working there was very, very different than I was used to. The way to build relationships was much harder. Breaking down silos and kind of barriers with people and building trust was very different than it was within Asia. So each place, different challenges, growth opportunities, both professionally and personally.
Oh, that's great. And we'll find that book and throw a link in the
Yeah, I have to. It's like Cultural Shock or Culture Shock Asia or Culture Shock, something like that. I can find it for you at some point. It's, again, many years ago now.
Well, Andrew, a question we ask most folks to come on is, and I'm interested in your answer based on the somewhat of a pivot you took career-wise. Anything in your educational career that you look back now and has provided a backdrop or some foundation into what you're doing that at the time you really didn't realize that it would?
Like an aha moment?
Yeah, or a course that you said, geez.
Of course.
At the time, it's like, okay, but now you look back and you're like, geez, I used a lot of this,
All right, Sean, I don't remember what I had for dinner last night, so now you're asking me to go back to courses. Probably not. I had some aha moments in my career that absolutely have impacted me. The first is, and this I would say to anyone from a standpoint of learning and taking on increased roles and responsibility, be a good listener. I was not a good listener early on in my career. I interrupted people all the time. And someone said to me, make sure that you practice wait. Do you know what wait is? Why am I talking? And that is something that just has stuck with me. And if you can be a good listener and listen not to provide an answer, listen to listen, really powerful. That was an aha moment for me. Not a course, but definitely something that I've taken with me along the way. I would say the other thing is, and if you want to call it a course, maybe there is a course like this now, is vulnerability. How can you be vulnerable? How can you be empathetic? How can you decompartmentalize your professional world, your personal world, to break down those barriers? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, everyone wanted to be seen as knowing it all, right? And never being, or being afraid to say, I don't know it, and dehumanizing that. And I was so guilty of compartmentalizing my professional world and my personal world. One of the best things I think that we can do, and I think actually COVID has done, is personalize the workforce in some ways. And how do you capitalize that and leverage on that? If you can have vulnerability and authenticity and empathetic leadership while still holding people accountable, I think it's a special sauce.
Yeah. Wow, that's great, Andrew. And yeah, I'm not sure if there's actually a formalized course around it, but I know there's a lot of stuff out there. So yeah, that will be another good one to link for us in the comments. So thanks. This is great. So we have kind of a background of kind of your early on journey, Andrew, and a question that I would have to maybe help us tie it together from a career perspective is, can you walk us through a guy that was, had a pretty unique skill set in a finance role at Gillette to the person that leads the HR and people function at Foundation Medicine, which, is a super highly regarded organization, not only in Greater Boston, but New England and, around the world. So can you help us, map how you make that decision to move into HR and kind of the journey that brings you to the head of the table, so to speak?
Yeah. So just to make sure I fully understand your question in regards to like, how do you go from a finance role into HR, or what are the skill sets that are similar? I just want to make sure I really answer your question.
Yeah, I guess really just more really interested, Andrew, in a timeline perspective. Like what were some of the important moves that led you to the executive position?
Okay. Again, the executive position, and just to be super crystal clear, like, I'm still learning, right? And that's something I would also say to everyone. Like, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, you're not. Always strive to be learning. Always strive to take opportunities and risks. And I think that's something that is really critical in no matter what role you're in, whether it be finance or in an HR role, and continually striving to develop or grow within your career. But one of the best things I would say is learn the business. And learning the business means a lot of different things. Like, we work within a commercial organization. Get out in the field, understand your customer, understand your product, and understand your value proposition. If you can do that, and then you can sell that, and you can have synergies in regards to the role that you play to the business objectives, and you can be tangible about that, that is going to be a value. That's going to be a value proposition for you.
And to that, and Andrew, when someone like me looks at your career, right, you started at Gillette, and I know you made a transition, you're the global benefits role, but is there a way that you learned the business? Were you a student of the business? Were you trying to find as much information as possible? Was it on the fly in the field?
No, that's a really, really good question. First off, I carried a bag. So I wanted to do some rotational assignments, and I carried a bag for a little while at Gillette, right? So I did some sales assignments. Seek out people who are experts within their role and their discipline, and understand how you, meaning the role that you play, can help them be successful. Really, really important. What can you do to help others be successful? Understand what their key success factors are, so that you can drive and marry towards some of those things. I'd say the one other thing is, never be afraid to ask for help. And people are often afraid to ask for help. It's one of the most powerful things you can do. Ask for help. Do not be afraid to say, I don't know. That's also something early on in my career I was not good at. Like, I always wanted to have the answer. I'd always felt I needed to have the answer. Don't always feel like you need to have the answer. And make sure you know individuals who do things better than you, so that you can learn from them. Tap into that expertise.
Yeah, That's great advice, Andrew, and it actually segues into the question I had next. The Boston HR Council community, like we talked on the front end, it's grown. It's a whole lot of folks. There's a I'm just ballparking here, but I want to say there's 400 or so folks in the BHRC that are vice president of fill in the blank center of excellence, right? They lead a COE at an organization. They are, subject matter experts, and they really kind of oversee, that, said function. And we've chatted with a lot of them that said, hey, we have no interest in ever being a CHRO or a chief people officer for fill in the blank reasons. Geez, the breadth of it kind of isn't who I am. I really like kind of staying in my lane. I'm just, a question to you. Was that ever something that you considered? Was being in that C-suite position always of interest? And how do you think about that? Just, I guess, point of view.
Yeah. So everyone's journey is so different and personal, right? From a standpoint of where you are professionally, where you are personally, where you have the most passion. You've got to go where you have the most passion. So, for example, I am not a benefits guy. Sorry, guys, but benefits just does not excite me. I knew I never wanted to be a head of comp and ben. I love comp, right? Because it's my finance background. But I always wanted to gravitate toward a role that was more broad. And that's one of the things why I left the finance organization. I felt it was a little bit too myopic for me. I didn't feel like I was having a broad enough impact on the organization. And the other thing is you have to, if you're going to be in this CHR role, C-level role, whatever you want to call it, you've got to love leading people. You've got to be, you have to recognize how important that role is, and what you say, what you do impacts individuals, not only individuals, but their family, right? And never underestimate that impact of how you're molding individuals. It's an honor. But you've got to want to do that, and you've got to have servant leadership. You've got to want to do things better for others than you want for yourself. And I'll say one other thing, Sean. There is an incredible amount of value, though, in having some type of specialist expertise when you are a CHRO. There is some benefit of understanding, like, okay, I really understand comp. Or I really understand talent acquisition, but you don't have to be an expert in everything. What you have to do is bring in people who are super good at what they do and make you better.
Great advice, Andrew, and thanks for that. So, kind of the back end of the episode here, Andrew, and we kind of root that in the future, right? And I know just in a lot of times that we've chatted, that you're someone that does think about the future a lot. Not only relative to your own organization, but just, as far as the function in general. So what are your thoughts, or how do you think about your role moving into the future?
My role personally, or just like the discipline of HR and the charter?
Yeah, I'd say the latter, more broadly thinking.
I worry a little bit about the workforce today. So let me just kind of walk you through this. 5 years ago, working from home was a luxury, right? You'd had to ask for approval, and you were seen as, if you're working from home, that you were really just taking a vacation day. But it was rare, right? I'm worried that sometimes we're moving a little bit too far on the pendulum in regards to entitlement. People, I feel, are a little bit too entitled sometimes right now, in the sense of, we're asking you to come back 2 days, 3 days a week. Let me be super, super clear. I never want to go back 5 days a week. I think there is huge value in the flexibility. I also think there's huge value, though, in the connection, collaboration, and the culture that being together brings, the ideation, the brainstorming, things of that nature. And I do worry that there is a little bit of an entitlement attitude across the board right now in regards to people's expectations. So how do we normalize that, again, is really important. The other piece I would say is, I think that COVID personalized the workforce. A lot of people say it depersonalized the workforce. But for example, right now, I'm looking inside your home, right? Or maybe your office. I'd never have that opportunity. I don't want to lose that. Like that that connection, that personalization is really important. And that worries me that we could lose that as we go back. That's something that's on my mind. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is on my mind. I don't know what that's going to look like in another 5 years, but how do we continually drive the need for diversity of thinking, the sense of belonging, safe space? I continually want to get better there. I want to push myself there. I think everyone should push themselves in that regard. I talked a little bit about this. I worry that leadership isn't empathetic enough and authentic enough and sincere enough. And I think sometimes people worry that or confuse empathetic leadership with lack of accountability. You can do both. And I think leaders have to continually focus on holding people accountable, having that metric-driven approach, but doing so with an empathetic lens. That is important to show that sense of vulnerability as we lead and some of the challenges that we have as we move forward. One last thing I would say, work is hard, right? And one of the things that I always think about is like, oh, when you go on a vacation, you have a great memory, or when you go to a wedding or you go to a reception or something, you have a great memory. When you think about work, do you think about times where you're like, oh, that was such a great memory or something that really stood out? How can we create memories for people? People choose to work at an organization. They have a choice. How can we continually create a memory for them so that they recognize that we see them differently as humans, we see them differently as people, and not only create that memory, but how can you bring it home? One of the things that people don't realize is the support system is so critically important in people's decisions. How can you continually ensure that you're attracting, you're nurturing, developing, and engaging people, and also bringing it home? So, for example, how do you personalize thank you notes? How do you personalize someone's efforts? I'm a big believer of handwritten notes. Send them home, because you know why? They're going to go home and say, that Andrew was a man, he is hard to work for. Then they're also going to say, wow. Or the family member is going to say, have you ever had a handwritten note sent from someone? Has anyone ever thanked you for a job well done or created a memory? Those are the things that worry me, because leadership is hard, but it's actually more simpler than that we can make it more simple just by being good people and being authentic and kind. And that is something that we all have to focus on and ensure that we're impacting people in a positive way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Andrew. I think that's an amazing piece of advice. And it brings us to the last question here on the episode, and something that we ask everyone is, what is your advice to the person listening to this that just landed either their first HR role, or perhaps they were pulled up to their first director level position and has had an aha moment and said, you know what, I love this. I would love to be in charge, in the charge of a whole function in a CHRO role someday. What's your advice to that person?
Pretty similar to some of the things I talked about early on. Go in and listen. Understand the business, understand what the chief executive officer needs and the executive team needs from you, and how can you be helpful for them to be successful. I would use weight. Make sure when you're talking, you're making a point, not just to be heard. There's a great saying that says, don't strive to make your presence noticed, strive to make your absence felt. And that is something that if you're not in a room and people recognize that, that's powerful.
That's awesome, Andrew. Well, this has been great. The conversation's been great, Andrew. I know we really appreciate it, and the community appreciates it. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing you in person out there at some time in the future.
Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciated it and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Andrew.